In part 1, we saw that Richard Thomalla, a construction engineer from Silesia, was deployed as part of the occupation troops in Poland after the conquest of that country by Nazi Germany. He worked on the construction of border defences in southeastern Poland and was based in the village of Bełżec. This was an SS project designed more to humiliate and torture Jewish people rather than have any practical benefit. The army was completely opposed to this project called the Burggraben, as the army considered it to be a waste of resources. However, it brought Thomalla to the attention of Odilo Globocnik, the SS and police leader in Lublin. Globocnik appointed Thomalla to the Central SS and Police Construction Directorate with an office in Zamość. After Thomalla was sent to Ukraine in the summer and autumn of 1941, Globocnik had him recalled as he had a new job for him. He was to construct the camps in which Globocnik was to kill all the Jews in the general government. It is often said that on the 20th of January 1942 a decision was made to murder all the Jews in Europe. That is not true. The decision to kill all the Jews had been taken earlier, but it's hard to say exactly when. The Wannsee Conference was just a planning meeting where people from various ministries got together and they decided what they could do. This is the Düben Heath to the northwest of Leipzig. In the spring of 1941, groups of men started to gather here for training, indoctrination and team building. These men formed the very basis of the Einsatzgruppen, which were to be unleashed on territories occupied by the Soviet Union and then on the Soviet Union itself. In my opinion, this clearly points to a decision to kill the Jews of the Soviet Union by the spring of 1941. Although I suppose it could be argued that their role was not just to kill Jews but anyone deemed hostile to the Nazi invaders. Indeed, whereas the overwhelming bulk of their victims were Jewish, not all of them were. Mass killings of Jews started a few days after the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. The Nazis had begun to destroy the mentally and physically challenged in occupied Poland in September 1939. The very first place where this happened was here, Pierznica Wielka, located to the north of Wejherowo in occupied Poland. The first victims were Poles likely to resist the Nazis, intelligentsia, community leaders and the like, anyone who might be deemed a threat to the new order. However, they were soon followed by people from care homes, both in the area of occupied Polish Pomerania and from all over the German Reich. At the same time, a rather crude gas chamber was built in Fort 7 in occupied Poznan in October 1939, and this was used to kill people from care homes near Poznan. Grafenek, in today's Baden-Württemberg, was the first such killing location inside Germany. At Grafenek, the victims were killed by gas, and these killings started in January 1940. Meanwhile, Sonderkommando Lange travelled around a part of Poland annexed to the Third Reich, the Reichsgau-Wartheland, with gas vans in which care patients were murdered. By the autumn of 1941, Sonderkommando Lange also started to murder Jews in these vans, and by the 8th of December 1941 had set up the first death camp at Helmno nad Nerem, Kulmhof, in German. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. In support of his Japanese ally, on the 11th of December 1941, Hitler convened the Reichstag to allow him to declare war on the United States of America. He kept his Gauleiters back in Berlin for a meeting that was held the following day in the Reich Chancery. It was then that Hitler told them of his plans to kill all the Jews of Europe. I've done a separate video on this subject and a link is provided below. However, preparations to kill the Jews living in the general government had already been made. Thomalla came to Lublin, where he was appointed head of the SS Zentralbauverwaltung, the SS Central Construction Administration. This is the monument at the death camp at Bełżec, which was opened on the 6th of June 2004. The monument consists of an alley which appears to get deeper. Around the walls of the monument are the names of the Jewish communities destroyed at Bełżec in 1942. Of course, when Thomalla arrived here, it looked nothing like this, but were he to reappear today, he would recognize a lot in the village of Bełżec. The construction of this camp started in the autumn of 1941, although the initial reason for the camp may not have been as part of a killing operation. It may not have been a purpose-built death camp as were later built at Sobibor and Treblinka. The person who designed the camp may not have even been Richard Thomalla, and he may only have been in charge of construction. He was there in October 1941. The camp, at least in part, was built using local paid labour. I interviewed one of the carpenters who assisted in the construction of the camp, and he was paid normally for the work he did. He said nothing of slave labour being used. Maybe he didn't see it, but it is possible that former Red Army soldiers who had been captured and were later trained at the camp at Travniki also assisted. The man I interviewed and the Travniki men may not have been at the camp working at the same time. However, we do have evidence from one person about what these Travniki men did there. Stanisław Kozak lived in Bełżec, and he described the beginning of the construction of the camp in 1946. In October 1941, 3 SS men came to Bełżec and demanded 20 men for the work from the municipal administration. The local council chose 20 workers from amongst the inhabitants of Bełżec, and I was one of them. The Germans selected the terrain to the southeast of the railway station, which adjoined a siding. The railway line to Lwów runs along this side track. We began to work on the 1st of November 1941 with the construction of huts on the plot adjoining the siding. One of the huts, which stood right next to the siding, was 50 metres long and 12.5 metres wide. The second hut was 25 metres long and 12.5 metres wide and was intended for the Jews who went to the baths. Next to this we built a third hut, which was 12 metres long and 8 metres wide. This hut was divided into 3 sections by wooden walls so that each section was 4 metres wide and 8 metres long. These sections were 2 metres high. The interior walls of these huts were built in such a way that we nailed the boards to them, filling in the empty space with sand. Inside the hut, the walls were covered with cardboard. In addition, the floors and the walls, to a height of 110 centimetres, were covered with sheet zinc. A 3-metre broad avenue, fenced in with barbed wire, which was also 3 metres high, led from the first to the second of the above-mentioned huts. A part of this fence, facing the siding and beyond it, was covered with pines and firs which had been specifically felled in order to conceal the siding. From the second hut, a covered passage around 2 metres wide, 2 metres high, and around 10 metres long led to a third hut. By way of this passage, one reached the passage of the third hut, from which 3 doors led to 3 sections. Each section of this hut had a door on its northern side, approximately 180 centimetres high and 110 centimetres wide. These doors, like the doors to the passage, were closely fitted with rubber. All the doors in this hut opened towards the outside. The doors were very strongly built of 7.5 centimetre thick planks and were secured against pressure from inside by a wooden bolt that was pushed inside 2 iron hooks, specifically fitted for the purpose. In each of the 3 sections of this hut, water pipes were fixed at a height of 10 centimetres from the floor. In addition, on the western wall of each section of this hut, water pipes branched off at an angle of 1 metre from the floor, ending in an opening directed towards the middle of the hut. The elbow pipes were connected to pipes which ran along the walls and under the floor. The trench had been dug by 70 blacks, that's to say, by former Soviet soldiers who worked with the Germans. They were named blacks because of the black uniform they wore. It was 6 meters deep, 20 meters wide, and 50 meters long. This was the first ditch in which the Jews killed at the extermination camp were buried. The blacks dug this ditch in 6 weeks at a time when we built the huts. The ditch was later continued as far as the middle of the northern border. That was already at a time when we were no longer working on the building of the huts. The first hut, which I mentioned, was at a distance of approximately 20 meters from the siding and 100 meters from the southern border. At that time, when we Poles were building the huts, the blacks put up the fence around the extermination camp. It consisted of posts with closely spaced barbed wire. After we had built the 3 huts described above, the Germans dismissed us Poles from the work on the 22nd of December 1941. Thomalla spent the winter of 1941-42 here in Lublin. Presumably, at least part of that time, he was drawing up plans for the death camps at Sobibor and Treblinka. The location for the Sobibor camp had been chosen by the SS Central Construction Administration, possibly even by him. In March 1942, he personally went to Sobibor to supervise construction work. Jan Piwonski, who worked at the railway station at Sobibor, recalled, "A German SS soldier who spoke very good Polish came to the station cafeteria. He came from Poznan or Silesia. When the woman behind the counter asked him what was going to be built there, he replied that she would soon find out, and that it was going to be a good laugh." Unlike Bełżec, which at least in part was built by private contractors, Sobibor was constructed by Jewish slave labour, mainly from the ghetto in Włodawa, overseen by SS personnel such as Thomalla and 2 general contracting companies from Germany. The camp is some 5 kilometres or so from the village of Sobibor, but it's right next to the railway station, which was little more than a siding. Thomalla realised that local railway workers would see the construction, and he warned them not to talk about what was happening. What they might see was to remain secret, and if anyone talked, then that person could be killed. The work was carried out at a fast pace, and the slaves could be brutally beaten or even killed. In the book Into That Darkness, Gitta Sereni reported that future Commandant Frank Stangl told her that he didn't know what was going on until one of the other SS reported that something strange was being built in the forest. This was the first gas chamber. Christian Wirth, Commandant at Bełżec, was there, accompanied by a chemist named either Dr. Blaurock or Blaubacher, as well as SS Unterscharführer Erich Fuchs. Upon completion of the construction work, extermination tests were conducted in mid-April 1942. SS Unterscharführer Erich Fuchs, who served also at Bełżec, described the preparations for the first gassing trials. On Wirth's instructions, I travelled by truck to Lvov and collected a gassing engine there, which I transported to Sobibor. In Sobibor, we unloaded the engine. It was a heavy Soviet gasoline engine, probably a tank or train engine, with at least 200 horsepower, a V engine with 8 cylinders and water-cooled. We stood the engine on a concrete base and connected the exhaust to a pipe conduit. Then I tried out the engine. To begin with, it didn't work. I managed to repair the ignition and the air intake so that the motor finally started. The chemist, whom I had met at Bełżec, entered the gas chamber with a measuring instrument in order to test the gas concentration. Next, an experimental gassing was carried out. I seem to recall that 30 to 40 women were gassed in one chamber. These women were Jewish. They had to undress on a covered piece of wood ground near the gas chamber, and were driven into the gas chamber by members of the SS, as well as by ex-Red Army volunteers. When the women were locked into the gas chamber, I, together with Bauer, operated the engine. Initially the engine idled. We both stood next to the engine and switched it so that the gases were conducted into the chamber. At the suggestion of the chemist, I adjusted the engine to a certain number of revs per minute so that no more gas had to be supplied. After approximately 10 minutes, all the women were dead. The chemist and the SS Führer gave the signal to switch off the motor. I packed up my tools and saw how the corpses were removed. Transport was by means of a rail trolley which ran from the gas chamber to a distant area. According to Eric Fuchs, Thomalla participated in the trial gassing of these people. Thomalla stayed in Sobibor at least until the end of April 1942. He's sometimes said to have been the first commandant of both this camp and Bełżec, but whereas he was in charge of the construction, it is perhaps unfair to say that he was the commander of either of the death camps. From Sobibor, Thomalla returned to Lublin. Next he was to plan Treblinka. He probably chose this location himself, close to a penal forced labour camp called Treblinka I. This camp was built next to a pre-war gravel pit which had been taken over by the SS. Treblinka II was built a few hundred metres to the east of Treblinka I. The slave labour was provided by prisoners from Treblinka I and inmates of the ghettos in Węgrów and Stoczek Węgrowski. As at Sobibor previously, Thomalla supervised the construction of the camp whilst his SS subordinates abused and murdered the Jewish workers. The victims were beaten to death, shot in collective and individual executions, and were even deliberately hit with tree trunks. The construction phase of Treblinka claimed a lot of lives according to eyewitnesses. In building the gas chamber, Thomalla was assisted by SS Unterscharführer Erwin Lambert, a chief of construction for technical matters from the euthanasia program. From Lublin, the movements of Thomalla are not clear. We know that in 1943 he headed construction works in Riga and Mogilev. He also returned to Zamość, where the Nazis attempted the murder and deportation of part of the Polish Catholic population with the aim of replacing them with ethnic Germans. The end of World War II found Thomalla in Yichin in Czechoslovakia. He appears to have been captured by the Soviets on or around the 5th of May 1945. He was placed in the NKVD prison located in the former monastery in Waldice. Historian Michael Tregenza told me that he had discovered the person who had shared a cell with him, and he had written a letter to the family of that person in the 1990s. However, the family was unable to give any further information as the name of Thomalla was never mentioned. It would appear that Richard Thomalla was taken out of his cell on the 12th of May 1945 and summarily shot. In 1957, a court in Neu-Ulm officially declared him dead. Nonetheless, German authorities investigating National Socialist era crimes at Ludwigsburg continue to have him on their wanted list until 1960, when they accepted finally that he was in fact dead. I appreciate that there's a lot of holes in this story and there are gaps which are unlikely to be filled. However, I would like to say a few words about the sources for it. The first source is Michael Tregenza, who has done a huge amount of work in Lublin investigating Operation Reinhardt since his first trip to Poland in 1965. This photograph was taken in London in Wonkai restaurant in Soho in October 2004. I don't know who the ladies are, they were just sitting with us at the table. But that's Mike with me. Mike has written a great deal and he's a huge source of information on this subject. The next source is Robert Kowalik, seen here in October 2013 with Teuwe Blatt, who escaped from Sobibor in 1943. Robert was in charge of the museum at Bełżec and also worked at Majdanek Museum. Here I've quoted from his work, Obóz Zagłady w Bełżcu. In 2013, Robert asked me to make sure there were enough photographs and recollections from Teuwe Blatt. Obviously, he was thinking that Teuwe would be dying before long. As it happened, Robert died before Teuwe. 8 months after this photograph was taken, he had a heart attack in Lviv. Teuwe Blatt wrote From the Ashes of Sobibor and Sobibor the Forgotten Revolt. Marek Bem was in charge of the museum in Sobibor. Here he is speaking at a conference in Travniki. He wrote Sobibor, Obóz Zagłady, 1942-1943. Marek died in 2023. Another source that I've used here is Gita Sereni's Into That Darkness about Franz Stangl and his role at Sobibor and Treblinka. Jules Shelvis was in Sobibor. He was an escapee. However, his wife and child were murdered there. I interviewed him, but I found his story of how he was sent out of Sobibor unlikely. I told Robert Kowalik about it, and he told me it was backed up by other evidence, and he believed it. Jules was from the Netherlands and spoke excellent English. He wrote Sobibor, A History of the Nazi Death Camp. I think he was the last of the Sobibor survivors to die. He died in 2016 at the age of 95. Other works I've used here are Co wiemy o Treblince, published by the Museum's Siedlce, and Chris Webb's works on Bełżec and Sobibor. Finally, I need to mention the records of various trials held in West Germany. I hope you found this interesting. I upload every Tuesday and every Friday at 2000 hours Central European Time. I'm usually in either Poland or in Germany. I also sometimes upload on other days as well, and if you want to know when I'm uploading, then you might want to subscribe. For the moment, you might want to see my video on Hitler's secret meeting where he announced his plans to kill all the Jews in Europe, a link to which will appear now.